Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Bridge with me, Michael Hansen. Today we have on an old friend of mine from university who's called Jodie Jackson, and she is the founder of the News Literacy Lab. She's the author of You Are What You Read, Why Changing Your Media Diet Can Change the World. And she's also the mother of 3 children, and actually becoming a mother inspired her to write a children's book called Little Ruffle and the World Beyond, which she's going to be talking about. She's going to be talking about what is this term news literacy. She's going to be talking about how can we spot fake news and false information. So we're going to be getting tactical, and also an overarching theme is how can we change our relationship with media, with the news, something I really relate to. As like a lot of people, I feel like when I turn on the news, it's just firing bad news at me, problem news, all the bad things that are happening in the world and not the good stuff. So Jodie's going to be talking about how we can change that relationship with the news. And I think you're going to enjoy the show. Let's get on with it. I know you're very passionate about this term news literacy, which you're kind of dedicating your career to at the moment. But I think a lot of people won't have heard that term before. So to kick off, it would be good to hear what is news literacy and why is it important to you?
So news literacy really is the skills to be able to navigate the news and make sense of it in our modern day lives. And it's interesting because you say, I have dedicated my life to it, but I think for the first 10 years that I was doing this, I didn't even realize that that was the term. I had become affected by the news. I was trying to understand my experience of it. I was trying to create a much healthier relationship with it. And it wasn't until I, written my first book and even created my children's book that I realized actually what I'm doing is news literacy. So I completely appreciate that it might be a fairly abstract term to a lot of people, not least of all because I was so close to it and didn't realize, but it's just having the skills to be able to use information in a way that provides value to your life, where it can be a tool to help you make sense of the world and feel empowered to contribute in some way towards it.
Okay. And I wanted to talk because I find, especially on this podcast and just in general, I find often people get into topics through their own journey, like you said, with your own relationship to the news. So maybe you could tell us a little about your own personal story, like with the news and your consumption of the news and how it led to, you dedicating yourself to this.
Yeah, well, I got into this mainly because I was really dissatisfied with the product. So I felt that and it was more than that, because I actually became really affected by the news. I was probably about 22, 23, and I felt overwhelmed and really depressed about the state of the world and disappointed in humanity. That was kind of my backdrop that I had when trying to make sense of the world, because I watched the news so regularly and it was all terrible and it was awful and it was terrifying. And so I didn't always feel like that. I watched the news daily. So it was a really gradual progression. It moved me from being someone who was really engaged with the news to someone who couldn't stand it. That process was incredibly gradual. And it was only when I realized that I couldn't stand it that I began to do something about it. And my initial reaction was to just switch off from the news, just to stop watching it. And I actually realized that that was a really ineffective strategy, especially in the long term, because the news will find you. Whether or not you're choosing it, it will seek you out. It will be in a conversation you have with a friend. It will be on, the radio, on your taxi on a night out. The stories will still find you. And it didn't really fix the problem that I was trying to solve. And so, I was curious about the world. I did want to know about what was going on. I just couldn't bear to hear another problem or another failure or another horror story. And so I created a platform called What a Good Week, which was a sort of solutions-focused platform that actively searched for people fixing the world, for people doing something in response to these problems that I was hearing about. So I began actively seeking solutions. And I experienced such a profound shift in myself from changing my media diet that I wanted to understand it more deeply. So I went back to university. I did a master's in positive psychology to actually research the impact of news on mental health. And what I realized when I was doing that was that this wasn't just my problem. although it had begun in that way, what I realized is this was a problem for a lot of people. And in fact, finding the news too depressing is the single biggest reason for audience disengagement. And so it became a much bigger mission beyond just understanding my experience. I wanted to help other people understand theirs and empower them with the same tools that I had created and learned over this journey, to be able to help themselves move through this space. And that's kind of how it began.
So you said you went back to university, you studied positive psychology, and you kind of were looking at the effect of news on mental health. What did you find was kind of interesting data, interesting stories you were hearing during that year?
I mean, the overarching thing really is that there was a century's worth of research that demonstrated, or evidenced, I should say, the detrimental psychological effects of the negativity bias. And there was virtually no research at the time around the impact of solutions journalism or around positive sort of solutions focused content. So that was what my thesis became. But when I look back at the research over the last century around the negativity bias, it showed that, prolonged exposure over long periods of time to predominantly negative content or problems focused content can make us feel anxious, can make us feel depressed. And by the way, not necessarily anxious about a particular issue, just generally anxious. Because if you experience a state of anxiety and you experience it frequently enough and often enough, especially over a long period of time, it moves from being a state feeling to a trait feeling. So it actually becomes a much more stable feeling within you of anxiety. So you can feel anxious about anything. It can make you feel depressed, fearful. And these are all quite isolating emotional responses, especially fear, because it's quite self-protective emotion. And when we're in a sort of state of self-protection, we become less concerned about other people and the problems that they could be facing. It also makes us feel more hostile, increases our levels of contempt towards other people. It can make us feel helpless. So it's a term called learned helplessness, where when you are continuously witnessing unresolved problems, it actually creates a belief within you that they're not solvable, that these problems are just too big to solve. And it actually creates a state of apathy or disengagement where you sort of stop trying. You move away from the problem to try and protect yourself rather than towards it, to try and sort of fix and solve it, because you don't necessarily feel able to. So that is, and ultimately, as I said before, you can disengage. And the disengaging is for two reasons. One is a very conscious disengagement. Because of all those feelings, people don't want to feel like that. And so they just step away from the news altogether. And it's a deliberate choice. The other form of disengagement is much less conscious. It's a subconscious, kind of almost acclimatization. So we become so used to hearing about these extreme and extraordinary stories that they become very normal and ordinary. They lose their shock value. We just become desensitized to them. So that can be described as compassion fatigue or apathy, but either way, we become less responsive in one way or another.
I was watching your TED talk before the show, which is something we'll put in the show notes. And I heard the thing you've mentioned today around you had that journey of, the news making you depressed. And I went through the same thing myself. And I think I've maybe become a bit extreme, like you were saying, of like, I'm just not going to watch the news at all. But in my head, I do like to stay up to date with what's happening in the world. So, and as you said, I think the news can find you. So what advice would you have to people like me? And I'm sure there's many people who are like this, and yourself previously, when you're in that situation where you're like, I'm just going to completely ignore the news because it's toxic and it's having like a negative impact on my mental health. Like, what advice would you give to people in that situation?
Seek solutions. It's such a profound and powerful shift. And it seems so simple, but it's so effective. Seek people and stories who are actually doing something to address these problems, to actually make progress, to provide some kind of, solution to these problems that you're turning away from. Because what has been shown when you actually include solutions into your media diet is that it does increase, firstly, it lowers your level of anxiety. It improves your mood in the short term, but it actually shifts your mindset in the longer term. So it expands your parameters for what is actually possible. And this really increases your own sense of resilience, where you don't even necessarily feel the need to turn away from these problems in the same way. And that's mainly because it inspires feelings of hope, optimism, and self-efficacy. So these combined is the belief that the future can get better. Not that it will get better necessarily, but that it can get better. There's potential for it to get better. And the reason that's developed, in order to have hope, you have to believe that the future can get better. But in order to sustain hope, you have to have evidence that the future can get better. And that's where solutions journalism is so powerful, because it provides evidence that change can happen, that progress is possible, and that actions do matter. And that's the third one, is the self-efficacy. So that's the belief that our actions are able to make a difference. And actually these stories provide an enormous amount of they invite us really to have hope. They invite us to create a different picture. And it's not to shield ourselves from the world's problems. It's not saying, just seek solutions and just surround yourself with sort of positive focused content. It's to actually say, allow yourself to see what's possible in the presence of a problem. Because people aren't just creating solutions to problems that don't exist. So they're very much tied to the thing that you're trying to avoid by switching off from the news. But what it does is it makes a much more complete narrative, where yes, you hear about the problem, and we need to, because unless we're made aware of a problem, we're not in a position to be able to confront and correct it. So it is a good thing. We do need to know about a problem. But then what else are we feeling? We can feel fear, anxiety, worry, frustration, anger. But if we combine that, if we expand the story and we combine those feelings with hope, with resilience, with human connection, with compassion, with empathy, with a feeling of empoweredness, that actually is what creates the transformation. And that's true of personal growth, and it's true of social growth and development as well. It's actually by combining these mixed emotional states that we create growth. We move through towards something better. And so when I say seek solutions, it's not necessarily to avoid or ignore the more painful stories about the world. It's that by doing that, you are going to be more resilient and capable to connect with them in a way that doesn't leave you feeling totally overwhelmed. It actually makes you feel really empowered and energized and capable of contribution.
Yeah, one of the things I liked in your video as well was, or the TED Talk was thing around like almost consciously engaging with the news. You were saying like seek out the news, because otherwise the news will seek you out. And I imagine you're referring to like you're on social media or whatever it is, and news is almost attacking you in a way. And it's funny because we had on a podcast a social media addiction expert, and she said the same thing, which is you don't have to get rid of social media. If you go on social media, use it consciously. So if you're going to send someone a message or going on a profile, just do that and leave, versus you're just like subconsciously there like scrolling for 20 minutes. So it reminded me of that. But is that because obviously you're talking about, okay, seek solutions versus like the thing that's annoying you about the news? Is that the type of thing you're talking about when you talk about seek solutions? Or?
Well, it's deliberate. You can't accidentally seek solutions because there aren't enough of them in the media. So it's one form of deliberate search. So, if you just have the default settings of the media, you can either design them or you can have the default settings. The default settings aren't necessarily set up to be in your best interests. And so what we talk about is designing our information settings, actually deciding what we want to be engaging with the news for. Something that I speak to my students about in one of the sort of early sessions we compare it to kind of food. If we were to eat food for pleasure, we'd consume it very differently to if we ate it for health. And so we ask them to kind of set an intention for their media use or for their information or news use. What are you actually engaging with it for? Because actually, if we can create a purpose, it can override the preference. It can override the kind of more habitual nature of how we just intuitively engage with it, because we've actually got an intention and a deliberate action, and that invites a experience. So one of the ones for me was seeking solutions. I don't give like a prescriptive media diet for anybody. We sort of talk more about how information is produced, what are the incentives for productions, what are the impacts on us, so that people really are empowered to be able to make informed choices for themselves. So being deliberate is the key one. And then how that deliberate sort of behavior shows up, whether it's in seeking solutions, whether or not it's coming offline, whether it's setting time limits for yourself, whether or not it's moving from a fast news format to a slow news format, whatever it is, and that's your choice. It's just bringing some awareness into that decision. So it is your decision, not the decision of somebody who knows how to speak to your subconscious through these information spaces.
Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking about with the news recently as well is obviously there's a big theme everyone talks about, that the world is so polarized, the world's more polarized than it's ever been. And I think whether you log into social media or you watch the news, it just seems like everyone is almost crazy in a way. They're like extreme right, extreme left, extreme, just having quite extremist opinions. And I think, especially if you're someone that spends a lot of time at home, remote working, whatever it is, it can seem like the world's mad. But what I found is just going out into the street and speaking to people, most people are like pretty normal. And I just thought of this now because I feel like it kind of relates to what you're talking about with, news literacy, that the news is painting this picture that the whole world is like at war and divided, when the reality, when I go out on the street in London, is like everyone's getting on and is actually like relatively normal.
Yeah, I mean, TV loves conflict, and so does social media. And what you have to remember as well is that content is prioritized because of engagement rather than for any kind of any other purpose. Engagement is the primary objective for prioritizing content online. And so because of that, it does prioritize negative content, because negative content grabs our attention, and it does like drama and conflict and all of those other things. I mean, even when you look at the way in which TV debates sometimes are set up around issues, it's kind of already polarizing before the national conversation around it's begun, because you'll take two people of opposing views, usually at fairly, probably more extreme ends than kind of moderate ends. And then if you agree with one, you can't agree with the other because there's no common ground in the debate. So you're kind of pushed to your own extremities of your thoughts and pushed away from common ground in that respect. There's two really good books, actually. There's one called Hate Inc., which is, I think I've actually got it stacked up under here by Matt Tabai. And there's another one called Them, which is by a guy called Ben Sass. Says Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. And it really is around the fact that the means by which we've created this mass communication has also created an enormous amount of tribalism. And you've got these camps and, all of this kind of negative, argumentative, sassy, shorthand comments online. And it's not necessarily productive to a, constructive dialogue around these big issues that we're all talking about.
Yeah. I think with your topic of like being deliberate as well with the news and what we can do personally, a big theme that comes up on the show is like accountability to ourselves. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about as well, that, correct me if I'm wrong, that we've also got our own role to play in this. Like, we can't just blame the news and, the news is so bad, we live in this terrible world where people are feeding us this bad information, but we can also be proactive and change our relationship and seek out solution-driven news, as you said, not just ignoring problems, but hey, this is a problem, this is a solution, versus like blaming the news. I think we also need to look at ourselves, I guess, in these situations.
100%. I mean, that's, we have a huge amount of power as the consumer because of the fact that they are chasing our engagement. We've just said that if engagement is the biggest metric of success online, we hold the power because it's our engagement that's actually driving those metrics. And so, when we speak with the students as well, we talk about the fact that we're not just consumers. This is a two-way street now. We all are producers. We all have a news feed. So we are all, in a sense, news curators, even if not news publishers. So what does our news feed look like? What are our ethics of production? How do we decide what stories we want to amplify and share and put out into the world? Because all of that feeds in to what we end up seeing. And so I think that there is a huge amount of power that we have as consumers to recognize our role within this. Any industry that's gone through a sustained shift towards a more positive purpose has relied to some extent on a conscious consumer. So if we can increase our awareness, have an education and understanding about the impact that information has on us, but also the impact that we have on the information environment as well, it creates a really powerful everybody is empowered to make a difference.
Yeah. I wanted to play devil's advocate as well here, because I think a lot of people do see the world the way the news sees the world, right? And so I think there will be people out there that may think, oh, Jodie, she's like got her head in the sky in the clouds, and the world is so bad, everyone's divided, and like, I know you're a mother of 3 children, but there's a big thing of like, I don't want to have kids because the world's so bad, and all this stuff that gets into people's heads. So what would you say to people in terms, because I know there's a lot of data in your in some of your work around the way the world's improved, but what do you say to people? Oh, the world is so much worse than it used to be. What would you say to someone like that?
I mean, it depends over what metrics you're measuring it, right? The world is such a big thing to actually just kind of decide whether or not it's going up or going down. You kind of got to split it out as to what metrics you're actually measuring when you're saying it's getting better or getting worse. For example, we can look at the fact that there's fewer people living in extreme levels of poverty than there's ever been. We have increased levels of health. People are living for far longer now than they used to. We have increased levels of education and literacy. And this is globally speaking when I talk about this. We have lower levels of child mortality. We have fewer deaths from conflict. We've made meaningful progress in our development of renewable energy, as well as being able to afford better access to it. The health changes, especially with the use of technology, it's almost miraculous. It's incredible to see what we're able to actually address on a medical scale as well. So there are lots of different metrics to say that things are improving, but there's also a lot of metrics to say, well, there's also things that are getting worse and that do need immediate attention, and they do need our resources to be able to address them effectively. Because the thing about progress as well is it's not just linear. It doesn't just go up and up and up. We have periods where it will either stall or even regress. But if you look at the data over the last kind of 2 centuries, 3 centuries, even the last millennia, the story of humanity has been one of progress. It has been the fact that things have increasingly got better, but we kind of acclimatized to them. And not only that, but the way in which the news reports on stories, it doesn't report on long-term trends. It is short, episodic stories, and it focuses very much on problems, because if we're able to become aware of problems, we can ultimately solve them and liberate ourselves from them. But the problem is that because we don't ever hear that second part where we fix them, it just seems like they're endless and continuous. And so it makes us feel like the world is getting worse. And then you have people come in and promise a restoration of the good old days, and it creates this sense of nostalgia for a time that really never was. And it can really prey on our fears in a way that creates a different outcome moving forward. So I think that it's really important that we connect with the data, with the slower story, with what's happening underneath the surface of these episodic kind of stories that happen in the news, because it does paint a very different picture. And there's a really great organization called Gapminder, and they do a quiz where they have loads of different questions across lots of different topics to actually show how poorly informed we are about the state of the world. And it's something I do with my students. So I take 5 questions and we start the class. This is the one where we're talking about the negativity bias and its impact it has on our understanding, or I should say lack of understanding of the world. And so they answer all of the questions, and then everybody stands up, but they do it silently. So they write them down. I put them on the board, they answer them. And then we all stand up and I say, right, okay, if you get one of these questions wrong, then just sit down. And then by the end of the 5 questions, you realize nobody is standing up because, and even if it was guesswork, you would expect some people to be standing up. But the fact is we are fundamentally wrong about so many big global trends, because our educated guesses are pegged to a really negative and cynical picture of reality. And that's not always the case. It's not to say that everything's perfect everywhere, always. No. It's to say that there are instances where actually we are misinformed because the story that we get isn't representative of the reality. We create this very distorted picture by focusing so heavily on problems and totally ignoring or minimizing solutions. And the thing about, especially around climate communication at the moment, we're just looking at is doomism the new delay? You know, the fact that people have this inevitability around it, can't fix it, it's too big, it's too, you know, my actions don't matter. All of this is slowing down response in a way. And when you actually are able, as I said, to believe that change is possible, that progress can happen, and you can see it across all of these different data points, then you can say, well, hang on a second, if we fixed all of these other problems before, surely we can do it again with the right resources. And so it's how do we actually recognize that hope is a really critical ingredient to creating effective action to address these problems, not to just make us feel better about them. It's a really practical resource to actually help us fix them, because there are still many problems that are real and that are fierce and that need our attention. And so what attention are we giving it, and how is that productive or helpful?
Yeah, when I was reading what you were saying and listening now around, like, it's not to ignore problems, because we need to identify problems, but it's more like, okay, we got a problem, what's the solution? And I was thinking about, in some of the work that I do with like training salespeople and even with marketing, it's, yes, you sell problems, but then you're not ever going to be able to sell a deal unless you present a solution to that problem. And I always give the example of, like, you always need a villain in your story. So you need, like, I give the example of the Lion King because everyone's seen it. So you need Scar in the Lion King. I guess the analogy I'm thinking now is the way you're describing it. It's almost like the news, the end of the Lion King would be like when Mufasa died and like Scar killed Mufasa and Simba thinks he's dead, right? But that would be the end of the film halfway through, versus like him coming back and like saving Pride Land, you know? And it seems they're more focused on that, the death and the destruction, versus, you know, all the great things that all the stuff you listed before around, you know, increased life expectancy, increased healthcare, all these things are things that we're not talking about enough.
Yeah, and it's not just knowing that things have gotten better, it's knowing how they have and why they have.
Yeah.
That's the story, really, because that gives us critical information. Because if we can learn from how communities are successfully responding to problems, it gives us the information we need to be able to effectively replicate them or implement them. You know, it helps us actually recognize effective action. And not only that, it can then put pressure on governments, on organizations, on businesses, even on individuals to do something about it, because progress and possibility make inaction towards a problem unacceptable. And the fact is, especially when it comes to climate, we have all of the solutions that we need to fix the climate crisis. They exist. We don't need to wait for technology to catch up with this, that, or the other, or for this to change or that to come into existence. And if that doesn't make you angry that we have all of the solutions right now, then you know, it's not a pacifying feat to have solutions. It's not to say you can rest on your laurels because there's someone doing something about it. It's to show that when someone does something about it, it's effective. And so that kind of ignites a sense within you of saying, I remember seeing this talk actually when I was doing my TEDx talk. There was another guy, Felix, speaking about an energy program. And it was incredible. I mean, it blew my mind. It was stuff I just hadn't heard of before. I was totally unaware of it, of how, you know, they were building these communities and kind of creating community power structures. And I was just like, this is incredible. And when I was listening to it, I was like, why aren't we doing this? This is amazing. And by the end of it, I was furious. I was almost like, why aren't we doing this? This is nuts. And it really does, you know, solutions don't pacify you. They can be incredibly energizing and they can hold power to account in a way that problems can't always do. You know, it's not to say that one is more valuable than the other. We need both. And problems can be really illuminating and they can be really powerful to actually, you know, hold power to account and get them to address things. It's just saying, so can solutions. You know, it's not replacing one with the other. It's expanding our resources and our toolbox of storytelling to show what is actually effective at creating positive social change.
Yes, you brought up earlier around like hope as well, and I think you're saying hope can actually be practical. And I know this is a subject you wanted to talk about, so whenever you could talk to us about hope.
Yeah, so hope is obviously an often mischaracterized word, really, because sometimes it can be sort of brushed off as being kind of a futile, wishful thinking kind of headspace. And what the research says around it, because this was the biggest thing that came up from the curriculum that we did with the students, hope was one of the biggest themes that emerged. And we actually called our research report Navigating News, Nurturing Hope, because it was such a powerful theme, really, that came out from it. And what hope is it's a belief. So it's not an emotion, it's a belief that the future can get better. But it's also not a fixed state of mind. It's not necessarily that like you'll believe it no matter what evidence you're shown or anything, like I have hope, I'm just going to stay here in this thought that everything's going to be okay. It's not necessarily like that. It's been described kind of more like a muscle rather than a static thing. So it can strengthen or deteriorate over time. And the kind of what determines the strength of that muscle is evidence and self-efficacy. So evidence that that progress is possible, that change can happen, and self-efficacy, which is the belief that our actions are able to make a difference. And that's why solutions journalism is so powerful, because it does provide stories that showcase evidence that change is possible and that actions do matter. And more importantly, what we saw since, and especially because, you know, news literacy is so heavily linked to democracy and to kind of preserving and supporting democracy and increasing people's civic engagement. And what we found is that hope is a critical psychological ingredient to actually ignite civic engagement. Because if you believe that a problem is fixable, if you believe that progress can happen, it's not necessarily to say that it's going to be easy, but if there's even a slither of possibility, you're much more likely to approach a problem and persevere if you don't solve it straight away. And it's called active coping. So it's when, in order to lower your levels of distress, you fix the problem. Whereas people who have low levels of hope or are pessimistic, they avoid the problem. They move away from it in order to lower their levels of distress. And so actually, it's kind of, when you think about the practical application of hope, it really lies in the fact that unless we believe that change is possible, we just won't bother trying in the first place.
I was just about to ask that, actually. So to confirm, so with the active coping, people that have more hope, the reason they'll tackle the problems is they think if they tackle the problem, there may be a better outcome. Whereas a person who doesn't have hope is like, what's the point? Because nothing's going to change anyway. Oh.
Yeah, partly. And it also, it comes from a belief that they can make a difference. You know, if you feel like you can't make a difference, if you feel helpless, and like your actions don't matter, you're much less likely, it's not to say that you won't, but you're much less likely to engage with the same kind of tenacity and grit that you would if you believe that ultimately this is solvable. I mean, I'm sure you might have had in your life experiences, as I'm sure many people would. You know, we can amaze ourselves with what we can actually do sometimes, even though we don't know how we're going to do it. We just feel like that's something that we should be doing, or that we could do, or that might happen. And there's an element of needing to believe that it matters and that it will make a difference in some way.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And I think I've been reading a lot about dreams, actually. And often we get messages in our dreams, and then we wake up and we're like, oh, wow, I found a solution to that problem that I didn't realize I had in me. I wanted to ask about your the types of people you work with, your students. Is it like a range of ages, demographics? Like, talk to us more about the people that you're working with.
So the pilot program that we just ran was for 16 to 17-year-olds. And that was, I mean, it was an incredible experience, because I'm used to working predominantly with adults. And again, people kind of in the media space or in the psychology space, but we're all quite energized around addressing this problem. So you kind of, you know, when you have these conversations, they're really quite electric, and there's so much energy and excitement around a lot of the topics that we're talking about. Even if you're conflicting in how you'd approach it, there's still a lot of passion. And then you get into a classroom with 16, 17-year-olds and talk to them about the news. And it's just like, so that was an incredibly humbling experience. And I had to fairly, you know, really think about, you know, how to make this engaging and relevant and, you know, interesting to them in a way that makes it matter to them as well. That's the other thing, right? Because so much of news literacy often talks about democracy being the benefactor. And because we're in a democratic state, then individuals can independently flourish, and they will be the secondary kind of benefactors in a way. And what I really wanted to do with my course was reverse engineer that to say, this is about you, about your mental health, about your ability to engage with issues that you care about your own social value, your sense of self-worth. The spillover effect of those actions will be society and democracy. But this is immediately, hopefully, beneficial for you now, today, because you can make those choices and changes right now. So that's kind of how we designed it. And we worked with 16, 17-year-olds for a term, and we've got the report coming out next week. So that was a great experience. And now we've got the kind of curriculum, we've tested it, we've refined it based on, speaking to the students and the teachers. We're now hoping to kind of scale this up and get it into a lot more schools so that, young people can start thinking about this.
Yeah. And are you teaching them similar things to what we talked about today about being deliberate, the way they, consume the news?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like in this conversation, we've deep dived on solutions journalism and the kind of mental health impact of news, just because I think that's always been my kind of main area of interest, and that's how it all started for me. But the curriculum is much broader than that. So the first module, we talk about, why do we even have news? When it's functioning at its best, what value does it provide society? And we look at the kind of ideals of journalism and then question if those ideals are met in practice. Then the second module is around, when information goes bad. So we look at misdis and malinformation, how we can actually spot and stop false information or misleading information. And then we look at the third module is around understanding bias. So we look at kind of language that's used, ways we can spot agenda within kind of narratives, and helping recognize that people want us to think in a certain way, being able to create that buffer and critical thinking. And then it's only at that point that we move into the most predominant bias, which is the negativity bias. We talk about solutions journalism, but then in the final module, we talk about from production to processing. So we look at how our brains actually work, how we process information, what are our biases, how are those biases built into our information structures, how can we, take back more control over our minds. So there's a whole broad, it's a really broad curriculum that covers a lot of different topics. And yes, solutions journalism does feature in there because it is incredibly important, especially to calibrate, to create a more accurate understanding of the world. But it's certainly not the only thing that we cover in the time with the students.
So going back to, I think you said it was the second module around like false information, and obviously a lot of people calling it fake news, which has been a big theme in like a lot of recent elections. And then, as you said, when we're consuming news as well, these are, especially on social media where anyone can post anything, this is, I think, going to be a really important skill going forward. So what are your tactics for people? How do you spot fake news and false information?
So there's lots of different systems. We have a 6 W's is our kind of worksheet that we work through the students with. So it's the who, what, where, when, why, and what next. So we look at who's actually writing the article, what is the platform that it's on, when was it published? Because as well, the timing of things can be not clear online. And things move quickly. So if you're looking at an article from 3 years ago, it might not necessarily hold as much truth as it did then. We look at what type of story it is, whether it's an opinion piece, whether or not it's an investigative piece. What are you kind of read around the article before you actually read the story itself. There's lots of little spaces where you can see, who is it funded by? Is it in partnership with someone? Is it sponsored content? When you understand the kind of different forms of fake news as well, because we separate out the term fake news. We look at it being clickbait, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. There's lots of kind of different categories of fake news. So if we can categorize them, it then becomes easier to spot them. And then if you accompany that with the 6 W's, it can actually be a really useful way to just identify credibility. Because online, there's so many misleading cues of credibility. And so if you can actually figure out where the signals are of what you should be looking out for, then it becomes quite useful to be able to kind of shortcut some of those decisions to actually figure out what's useful. But the thing as well that we have to talk about when I say that, because that sounds really laborious, and it is to a certain extent, to exist in a toxic space and have to check the credibility of every piece of information is time consuming. And not only that, But I think the average person in the UK scrolls through 914 meters of content a day. So that's 3 times as tall as the Eiffel Tower. Now, if you're expecting somebody to do the 6 W's on every piece of information that they read, that's just not practical. You may as well not give them any advice. So a lot of what we talk about as well is there are certain things we can do to protect ourselves in unsafe spaces, but a much more effective thing we could do is to create safer spaces so that we can more passively exist, and we can, front end that effort and curate for ourselves. We follow accounts, we build our own feeds around quality information, and then we don't have to do as much legwork ourselves to be able to verify it.
I guess that goes back to what we talked about earlier around people have to hold themselves accountable and construct their social media and news feeds however it is, like you were saying, not just having the news come at them, but actually they're consciously engaging with whatever sources that they want.
Yeah, but in order to do that, they kind of have to know the value of why they would be doing it in the first place. And so, there is the how, and we do there's a lot of practical things that we can do as news consumers, but the kind of big thing that we feed through the curriculum is why. Why does any of this matter? Why is it useful? Why does it matter to us? Why does it matter to our collective existence? All of those things really matter, because once you know the why, you'll find your own how. I could give you the 6 W's. There's lots of other different methods. I think there's a really one of the more used ones is called the CRAP method, but I can't remember what it stands for. It's CRAAP, but they use that a lot. And there's lots of kind of different anagrams that you can use to decide, how you're going to approach credibility when it comes to stories. But yeah, I think that if we're able to just have that awareness, create that kind of responsibleness within ourselves, we have to know why we're doing it. That's going to be the big driver of any kind of change.
100%.
And it kind of starts with us being the benefactor. That is the biggest incentive to change, because it's going to help improve your mental health. It's going to help improve your worldview, your sense of agency, all of those other things that we've spoken about. And that can be a bit of a carrot.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, we have the control, right? We're the ones who are the engagers on social media and the eyes on newspapers, etc. Obviously, being a mother is a life-changing experience. But I wonder, with this particular topic around false information, news literacy, did it change your views or approaches to any of your work as well?
Oh my God, it transformed everything. Yeah, it was, because I'd written my book, You Are What You Read, Why Change Your Media Diet Can Change the World. And that was for adults. And I was speaking to university students and speaking in mental health spaces. And then it wasn't when I had my kids, even with everything that I had learned, even with everything that I had understood and practiced, it was when COVID hit, I realized I couldn't be an effective mediator between my children and their information environment. They actually needed these skills from a much earlier age than I had them to be able to make sense of their information space. And so it was then that I wrote a children's book called Little Ruffle and the World Beyond, so that I could begin to speak to my kids about this. And then I created the junior school curriculum first, so the primary school curriculum, where it was 10 lesson plans to help children become empowered explorers, hopeful heroes, solution seekers, develop a gratitude attitude, and create calming moments. So there was 2 lesson plans for each of those categories. And then I sort of thought, actually, if I'm going to formalize this curriculum, I want to get into older students as well, because I want to cover some of these bigger, meatier, more complex topics, which, I just wouldn't have been able to do with 7-year-olds in the same way. So they transformed it from being something that I was interested in and connecting with other people that were interested in, to realizing that I wanted to give this skill to my children. And I had to create a format in a way that they could engage with it beyond just having a conversation with me. And again, if I'm teaching my kids, how many other kids can I teach as well?
Yeah. I guess that was a nice realization for you, because you've already got a lot of purpose, helping people, but now it's like you're helping the closest people in the world to you as well.
I'd like to think so, except saying that my children, because I'm their mum, of all of the people that actually listen to me, they are not them.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of people listening relate to that who are parents. One last question I wanted to ask. I'd like to get kind of very practical on the show. What's one tactic you recommend for the audience in terms of changing their negative or negativity bias, as you call it, relationship with the media and the news?
I would say sign up for, there's a newsletter called Future Crunch. And for me, that is the best example of solutions journalism. It curates, I think it's either a weekly or it's published every 2 weeks, but it's an aggregated newsletter of, they scan the web to find all of the progress that's taken place in between, their newsletters. And it's incredible what they find. And it's really amazing. If you want to at least balance and have some kind of understanding of what is working and where progress is taking place, I think that's probably the quickest and most accessible form of solutions journalism that I would recommend to people.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to sign up. We'll put it in the show notes as well. What about your own resources, books, etc.? Give you a little moment to promote anything that you want.
Should probably talk about that as well. Yeah. So, there's my book, You Are What You Read, Why Changing Your Media Diet Can Change the World. And I feel like that's the why, like I've just given you Future Crunch, which is the how. But as we said, I think if you really become motivated to actually make these changes, and it is effortful, it is effortful to be deliberate, but if you're incentivized, if you're motivated, and if you're energized to be, then it becomes a lot easier. So I like to think that my book provides that why, and that hopefully inspires and creates some kind of motivation for change as well.
Cool. We will put a link to that as well. And yeah, thanks so much for coming on today, Jodie. I've certainly found it interesting.
Thank you for having me.
So that's it. Unfortunately, we come to the end of the show today with Jodie Jackson. A couple of takeaways for me. The term I'm going to remember is active coping. I really like that. As Jodie said, this isn't about avoiding problems. Not saying we should never talk about problems on the news. But when we identify problems, we can write about them, but let's also write about the solutions, all the progress we've made in the world, as Jodie was talking about. And actually, that leads to hope, because if you want to address problems, you're more hopeful that they're going to be solved, versus for people that avoid the problems have less hope. There's a lot of studies around that, as Jodie said. And the final thing is, let's be conscious, as came up in the conversation with Sam Flynn. Let's be deliberate with our news consumption. She was talking about social media, but Jodie here has been talking about our relationship with the news. It should be conscious. It should be deliberate. If you've enjoyed this show, if you have a person in mind who has a toxic relationship with the news, send them this podcast, and would love to hear your feedback on it. And we will see you next time on the Cosmic Bridge. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us across your podcast platforms and YouTube. Cheers.